In the long stillness of early Japan, power once rested quietly in the capital, surrounded by ceremony, poetry, and carefully preserved rituals. The imperial court of the Heian period believed that order flowed naturally from refinement, that harmony could be maintained through tradition and rank. Yet beyond the polished halls of Kyoto, the land itself told a different story. Mountains, forests, and distant plains created a country difficult to govern from a single center. And in those spaces, authority began to drift away from words and titles and toward something more tangible. As estates spread into the countryside, the court increasingly relied on local families to manage land, collect taxes, and maintain peace. These families were not poets or courtiers. They were practical people, shaped by distance from the capital and the need to protect what they controlled. Over time, skill with horses and weapons became more valuable than lineage, traced through elegant scrolls. Quietly, almost unnoticed by those at court, a new type of figure began to appear, the mounted warrior. These early warriors did not yet think of themselves as a class apart. They were farmers when seasons demanded it, guards when danger threatened, and clan members bound by obligation rather than ideology. Their weapons were tools of survival more than symbols of honor. Yet the conditions that shaped them, long distances, local disputes, and the absence of immediate imperial power, encouraged independence. They learned to fight, to organize, and to respond quickly without waiting for orders from far away. The court, meanwhile, continued to view the countryside as a source of revenue rather than a potential rival. Conflicts between local clans were often settled informally or ignored entirely as long as taxes continued to flow. This indifference allowed warrior families to grow stronger, forging alliances through marriage and loyalty rather than imperial decree. Over generations, these bonds became more reliable than any distant promise from Kyoto. Weapons and tactics slowly evolved to suit this environment. The horse became central, allowing warriors to move across wide territories and strike with speed. Archery, practiced from horseback, was valued above all else, not as a sport, but as a practical skill refined through repetition. Fighting was not yet romanticized. It was direct, personal, and shaped by necessity. What emerged from this world was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual shift in gravity. Authority no longer flowed only downward from the emperor. It spread outward, settling into the hands of those who could enforce it. These warriors were still tied, at least in name, to the imperial system, but their daily reality was increasingly separate from it. In this quiet transformation, the foundations of the samurai age were laid. Nothing had formally changed, yet everything had begun to move. And, as the court remained focused on elegance and tradition, the countryside was preparing for a future where power would be carried not by words, but by those willing to defend their place in the world. As the decades passed, the presence of these provincial warriors became more defined, though still largely unacknowledged by the refined world of the capital. What had once been scattered local defenders slowly began to recognize one another as part of a shared way of life. Distance from the court fostered not only independence, but a sense of mutual understanding among those who lived by vigilance rather than ceremony. From this understanding, warrior clans began to take shape. These clans were not unified by grand ideology. They were bound instead by blood ties, shared risks, and a clear awareness of who could be relied upon in moments of danger. Loyalty was practical before it was moral. A warrior served the leader who protected his family and land, and leaders, in turn, depended on followers who could be trusted in conflict. Over time, these relationships formed layered networks of obligation, far stronger than distant imperial commands. Two great lineages gradually rose to prominence within this system: the Taira and the Minamoto. Both traced their ancestry to the imperial family, a connection that granted prestige while allowing them to operate far from the court's direct control. In the provinces, their names carried weight not because of ancient lineage alone, but because they commanded armed men and controlled territory. Power, increasingly, was something that could be seen and felt. The court began to sense this shift, though it struggled to respond effectively. Emperors and regents still held symbolic authority, but they lacked the means to enforce their will beyond the capital without relying on the very warriors whose influence concerned them. Appointments of provincial officials often went to members of warrior families, further entrenching their position. In attempting to govern the countryside, the court was quietly handing it over. With each generation, the warrior identity grew more distinct. Training in arms was passed from father to son. Stories of battles, ambushes, and rivalries circulated within families, shaping memory and expectation. Honor began to take form not as abstract virtue but as reputation, a measure of reliability, courage, and resolve observed by peers rather than decreed by authority. Yet this growing strength carried tension. As clans expanded, so did competition between them. Land disputes became sharper, alliances more fragile. The balance held only as long as conflicts remained local and manageable. Beneath the surface, however, ambition was growing, along with an unspoken awareness that the old order could be challenged more directly. By the late Heian period, Japan stood between two worlds. One was rooted in ritual, hierarchy, and inherited prestige. The other was shaped by force, loyalty, and control of land. They coexisted uneasily, each dependent on the other, neither fully dominant. This fragile balance could not last indefinitely. And as rival clans continued to strengthen their positions, the question was no longer whether power would shift, but when, and how openly, the warriors would step out of the shadows and into the center of Japan's history. When the balance finally broke, it did so not with quiet negotiation, but with open conflict that reshaped the country's sense of order. Tensions between the great warrior clans had been building for years, sharpened by court intrigues and competing claims to influence. What had once been distant rivalry now moved unmistakably toward war, drawing the aristocratic world into a struggle it could no longer control. The conflict that followed, later known as the Genpei War, unfolded over several years and across much of Japan. It was not a single battle, but a sequence of shifting alliances, betrayals, and campaigns that revealed how deeply the warrior class had embedded itself into the nation's political life. The court attempted to maneuver between factions, granting titles and favors, but its gestures carried less weight than they once had. Real decisions were being made on the battlefield. For the warriors involved, the war was both personal and transformative. Loyalty to clan became paramount, surpassing loyalty to court or emperor. Battles were fought not only for victory, but for recognition and survival within an emerging hierarchy of power. The ideals that would later be associated with the samurai, courage, endurance, and acceptance of death, were not yet formalized, but they were being tested and refined through experience. The war also exposed the vulnerability of the aristocratic elite. Noble families, long accustomed to influence without force, found themselves dependent on warriors for protection. Estates were seized, burned, or abandoned. The cultural confidence of the court began to fracture as the reality of armed power asserted itself. Poetry and protocol could not stop an advancing army. As the conflict progressed, the Minamoto clan gained momentum, adapting quickly to the demands of prolonged warfare. Leadership became more centralized, discipline more consistent. Victory did not come through a single decisive moment, but through endurance, strategic patience, and the ability to command loyalty over time. When the final battles ended, the result was unmistakable. The old aristocratic order had lost its dominance. The defeat of the Taira clan marked more than the end of a family's power. It symbolized the collapse of a system in which authority flowed primarily through birth and ceremony. In its place stood a new reality, one shaped by those who could organize force and maintain control beyond the capital. Yet even in victory, uncertainty lingered. The Minamoto leaders had proven their strength, but the structure of governance remained unresolved. Japan had entered a new era without a clear blueprint for how power should now be exercised. The court still existed, the emperor still reigned, but the center of gravity had shifted irreversibly. In the quiet aftermath of war, as fields were reclaimed and roads cleared, a deeper transformation continued to unfold. The warriors had stepped into the foreground of history, and with that step came responsibilities and contradictions they had never faced before. Questions that would shape the next phase of Japan's long warrior age. After the dust of war settled, Japan entered a period of uneasy stillness. The fighting had ended, but the question of how the country should now be governed remained unanswered. Victory on the battlefield did not automatically translate into a stable political order, and the warriors who had overturned the old system now faced the unfamiliar task of preserving peace. Power, once seized, needed structure. Minamoto no Yoritomo understood this quiet danger. Rather than ruling from the imperial capital, he chose to govern from Kamakura, far from the ceremonial world of Kyoto. This decision alone marked a profound shift. Authority no longer needed to sit beside the emperor to be legitimate. It could exist elsewhere, grounded in military loyalty rather than courtly tradition. From Kamakura, Yoritomo began to build something unprecedented, a government led by warriors for warriors. The structure he created was careful and restrained. The emperor and court were left intact, their rituals and titles preserved. On the surface, the old order appeared unchanged. Beneath it, however, real authority now rested with the shogun. A military leader granted the right to govern in the emperor's name. This separation of symbolic and practical power allowed the transition to occur without open rupture, easing resistance while securing control. Samurai were appointed as stewards and constables across the provinces, responsible for land administration, justice, and security. Their authority came not from ancient pedigree, but from service and loyalty. For the first time, the warrior class held formal, institutional power. Violence, once an informal necessity, was now regulated and channeled through governance. Yet this system carried its own tension. Warriors were trained for conflict, not administration. They governed through personal bonds and reputation rather than abstract law. Disputes were settled with an emphasis on loyalty and precedent, sometimes blurring the line between justice and power. Still, for a time, this arrangement brought a degree of stability unknown during the final years of the court's dominance. The Kamakura shogunate also reshaped the identity of the samurai. Service to a lord became a defining principle, and death in that service was increasingly framed as honorable. Religious ideas, particularly from Zen Buddhism, began to influence warrior thought, encouraging discipline, acceptance, and inward focus. These beliefs did not erase fear or ambition, but they offered a way to live with them. Life under the new government remained harsh for most. Peasants bore heavy burdens, and local conflicts never fully disappeared. Yet compared to the chaos of civil war, the country experienced a fragile calm. Roads reopened, estates stabilized, and generations grew up knowing only the authority of warrior rule. Still, this peace rested on narrow foundations. The system depended heavily on loyalty without offering sufficient reward, and as memories of war faded, dissatisfaction quietly spread. The shogunate had solved the problem of power, but not the deeper challenge of sustaining it over time. In this stillness, beneath apparent order, the next strain was already forming, a test that would come not from within Japan, but from beyond its shores. In the early years of the Kamakura government, peace carried an unspoken assumption that danger would come from within, as it always had. The samurai were prepared for rebellion, rivalry, and disputes over land. What they did not anticipate was a threat arriving from across the sea, one that neither tradition nor precedent had prepared them to face. When word first reached Japan of a vast foreign empire expanding eastward, it sounded distant, almost abstract, like a rumor carried on the wind. That distance vanished quickly. Envoys from the Mongol Empire arrived with demands for submission, speaking in the language of imperial authority unfamiliar to Japanese ears. The Kamakura leaders hesitated, unsure how to interpret this challenge. Japan had long viewed itself as existing at the edge of the known world, protected by the sea and by custom. The idea of answering to a foreign ruler was not simply unacceptable, it was incomprehensible. When invasion finally came, it did so with a force unlike anything Japan had seen. The Mongol armies were disciplined, coordinated, and supported by technologies unfamiliar to the samurai, including massed formations and explosive weapons. The traditional style of individual combat, shaped by honor and personal reputation, proved poorly suited to this new kind of warfare. Samurai charged bravely, but bravery alone could not overcome strategy built on scale and coordination. Yet the invasions did not end in conquest. Storms, later remembered as divine winds, shattered enemy fleets and forced their withdrawal. To later generations, these events would take on mythic meaning, reinforcing a sense of spiritual protection. At the time, however, the reality was more complex. Victory had come at enormous cost, and unlike internal wars, there was no land to seize, no defeated rivals to reward followers. This absence of reward quietly undermined the foundations of the Kamakura system. Samurai had fought and died in defense of the realm, but the shogunate could offer them little in return. Loyalty, once reinforced by tangible gain, began to feel hollow. Grievances accumulated, not loudly, but persistently, as families struggled to justify sacrifices that brought no lasting benefit. The strain extended beyond material concerns. The invasions forced the warrior class to confront their own limitations. Traditional tactics had failed, and survival had depended as much on chance as on skill. This realization unsettled deeply held assumptions about martial superiority and divine favor. Confidence remained outwardly intact, but beneath it lay doubt. Administratively, the shogunate stretched itself thin, attempting to maintain defenses along the coast while managing domestic order. Resources were diverted, attention divided. The delicate balance that had sustained Kamakura authority began to weaken, not through rebellion, but through exhaustion. In the years that followed, no new invasion came. Life gradually returned to its familiar rhythms. But the samurai system had been quietly altered. The sense of certainty that once anchored warrior rule had faded, replaced by unease and unmet expectation. And in that lingering silence after the storm, the question of leadership returned, not with urgency, but with inevitability, as Japan moved toward another slow, uncertain turning of its history. As the memory of the foreign threat slowly receded, Japan did not return to the confidence it once knew. The Kamakura shogunate still stood, its institutions intact, its authority outwardly unchallenged. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, the bonds that held the warrior government together were loosening. The strain left by the Mongol invasions had not healed. It had merely settled into the fabric of daily life. Samurai families found themselves increasingly burdened. Land was divided among heirs until holdings became too small to sustain households. Debts accumulated, often to moneylenders outside the warrior class, quietly shifting economic power away from those who carried swords. Service to the shogunate, once a source of status and opportunity, now felt obligatory rather than rewarding. Loyalty endured, but it did so more from habit than conviction. At the center of power, leadership weakened. The Minamoto line had ended, and real authority rested with regents who ruled in the name of child shoguns. Decision-making became cautious, sometimes indecisive, as leaders sought to preserve balance rather than confront underlying problems. This hesitation created space for resentment to grow, especially among warriors who felt overlooked or mistreated. The imperial court, long overshadowed, sensed this vulnerability. Though it lacked military force, it retained symbolic authority and cultural legitimacy. Some courtiers began to imagine a restoration of imperial rule, not through open battle, but through careful manipulation of loyalty and legitimacy. These ideas circulated quietly, gaining strength as dissatisfaction with the shogunate spread. Conflicts flared intermittently, not as sweeping wars, but as localized uprisings and disputes. Each was contained, yet each revealed the same pattern. The central government could still respond, but only with effort, and often too late to inspire confidence. Authority was becoming reactive rather than commanding. What made this period especially fragile was its slowness. There was no single collapse, no dramatic turning point. Instead, trust eroded incrementally. Samurai continued to serve, officials continued to govern, and rituals continued to be observed, but belief in the system itself was thinning. People followed rules because they existed, not because they felt inevitable. In time, this quiet weakening invited challenge. When rebellion finally came, it did not feel sudden to those living through it. It felt almost expected, as though a long-held tension had finally been allowed to release. The Kamakura order, once born from decisive action, now lacked the strength to adapt. As authority slipped from its grasp, Japan moved once more into uncertainty, where power would again be contested, not only with weapons, but with claims of legitimacy and visions of what rule should mean. And in that uncertainty, a new form of warrior government would begin to take shape. From the fading authority of Kamakura emerged a new attempt at order, shaped as much by compromise as by ambition. The Ashikaga shogunate did not rise through decisive conquest alone, but through a careful alignment of military strength and imperial legitimacy. When power shifted once more, it did so with the appearance of restoration, even as the deeper patterns of warrior rule continued. The new shoguns ruled from Kyoto, returning political life to the old capital. This proximity to the emperor gave their authority a familiar shape, easing the transition after years of instability. Court ceremonies resumed their prominence, and aristocratic culture regained visibility. Yet, behind the polished rituals, the balance of power remained uncertain. The shogun governed, but not with the firm control his Kamakura predecessors had once exercised. The Ashikaga relied heavily on alliances with powerful regional warriors. These local lords were granted broad autonomy in exchange for loyalty, creating a system that favored flexibility over centralization. In the short term, this approach reduced conflict. In the long term, it allowed regional power to grow largely unchecked. Authority became diffuse, shared among many who answered to the shogun only when it suited them. Culturally, this period flourished. Art, architecture, and philosophy thrived under the renewed interaction between court and warrior elites. Zen aesthetics influenced gardens, ink painting, and thought, emphasizing simplicity and restraint. For the samurai, these ideals offered a way to reconcile violence with inner discipline, reinforcing a self-image that blended refinement with strength. Politically, however, the system was fragile. Succession disputes within the shogunal family weakened central leadership. Decisions were often delayed or diluted by competing interests, leaving unresolved tensions beneath the surface. Regional lords learned to act independently, raising armies and administering lands with minimal interference. The emperor, though still lacking military force, became a symbol around which dissatisfaction could gather. Competing claims of legitimacy emerged, each appealing to tradition while serving contemporary ambition. This overlap of authority, court, shogun, and regional lord, created a landscape where responsibility was unclear and power constantly negotiated. For ordinary people, life continued much as before, shaped by the rhythms of agriculture and local authority. Yet the stability they experienced was increasingly dependent on individual lords rather than national governance. Peace existed, but it was uneven, varying from region to region. This delicate balance held for a time, sustained by mutual dependence and cultural cohesion. But it rested on foundations already showing strain. As rival interests multiplied and leadership faltered, the system edged closer to fracture. And in the quiet corridors of Kyoto, where ceremony masked uncertainty, the forces that would soon tear the country apart were slowly, inevitably gathering strength. The fracture, when it came, did not announce itself with a single decisive blow. It unfolded gradually through hesitation, rivalry, and unresolved tension at the heart of the Ashikaga government. The event that later generations would recognize as the turning point, the Onin War, began almost quietly as a dispute over succession. Yet beneath that narrow cause lay decades of accumulated strain, waiting for a moment to surface. Kyoto, once a symbol of order and continuity, became the stage for conflict. Powerful families aligned themselves with rival claims, not solely out of loyalty, but out of calculation. What began as a limited struggle soon expanded, drawing in regional lords who saw opportunity in chaos. The shogun, unable to impose a clear resolution, watched authority dissolve into competing commands. Fighting spread through the capital itself. Districts were fortified, streets turned into battlegrounds, and temples burned. For the first time in generations, The center of political and cultural life was consumed by prolonged violence. The court remained, but its voice carried little weight amid the clash of armies. Rituals continued in damaged halls, their persistence a quiet contrast to the disorder outside. As the war dragged on, its original purpose faded. Alliances shifted, leaders changed, and personal ambition replaced any remaining sense of common cause. Regional warriors, once restrained by obligation to the shogunate, returned home with hardened resolve. They had seen the weakness at the center, and they no longer believed in its authority. The consequences of the Onin War reached far beyond Kyoto. With central control effectively shattered, provinces became arenas of constant struggle. Local lords fortified their domains, raised standing armies, and governed independently. Loyalty flowed downward rather than upward, rooted in immediate protection rather than distant legitimacy. This marked the beginning of the Sengoku period, an age of warring states, though few living at the time could have named it as such. Order did not vanish entirely, but it fragmented. Each region followed its own rhythm of conflict and survival. Laws were local, justice personal, and peace temporary. For the samurai, this era demanded transformation. No longer simply retainers, many became strategists, administrators, and rulers. Warfare grew more systematic, less ceremonial. Victory depended on planning, supply, and adaptability as much as courage. The ideals of earlier generations remained in memory, but necessity reshaped practice. Yet, amid this relentless struggle, life endured. Farmers planted crops between campaigns. Towns grew around castles. Culture adapted, finding expression even in uncertain times. The country had not fallen into darkness. It had entered a long twilight of division. And within that twilight, new figures were rising. Individuals who saw in chaos not only danger, but the possibility of unity yet to come. The Sengoku period unfolded not as a single, unbroken war, but as a shifting landscape of conflict that reshaped every layer of Japanese society. Authority was no longer inherited by default. It had to be proven repeatedly, defended season after season. In this world, the samurai were no longer simply warriors in service. Many became rulers in their own right, responsible for land, people, and survival amid constant uncertainty. Regional lords, known as daimyo, built power through careful calculation. Castles rose across the countryside, not only as military strongholds, but as centers of administration. From these fortified towns, leaders collected taxes, enforced laws, and organized armies. Governance became practical and immediate, shaped by the needs of war rather than tradition. The distance between ruler and ruled narrowed, bound by shared risk. Warfare itself evolved. Battles grew larger, more coordinated, and increasingly impersonal. Infantry formations expanded, and the introduction of firearms altered long-established tactics. Skill with the sword remained respected, but discipline and numbers now mattered more. Victory belonged to those who adapted quickly, setting aside older ideals when they no longer served survival. For the samurai, this period demanded flexibility. Loyalty was still valued, but it was tested by shifting alliances and changing fortunes. Service to a lord offered protection, yet failure could mean ruin. Honor remained important, but it coexisted with pragmatism. The warrior code, later idealized, was being forged in compromise as much as conviction. Despite the violence, the Sengoku era was also a time of creativity. Trade expanded, towns grew, and new social classes gained influence. Merchants, artisans, and farmers all played roles in sustaining war-torn domains. Culture adapted, finding expression in local traditions, theater, and craftsmanship. Life did not pause. It adjusted. Amid this complexity, a new vision of authority began to emerge. Some leaders looked beyond regional dominance toward broader unification. They understood that endless conflict weakened all, and that stability could be as powerful as conquest. These ambitions did not arise from idealism, but from exhaustion and calculation. One such figure would soon alter the course of history. Rising from a modest background, he recognized the patterns of the age and learned to exploit them. Through decisive action and willingness to break tradition, he would challenge the very structure of the warring states. As the Sengoku period continued, its relentless rhythm carried Japan toward a moment when fragmentation would give way, not suddenly, but through the steady advance of ambition disciplined by force. In an age shaped by fragmentation, the appearance of decisive will carried a particular weight. Oda Nobunaga emerged from the Sengoku chaos not as a restorer of tradition, but as a disruptor of it. He did not seek legitimacy through ancient forms or symbolic authority. Instead, he relied on clarity of purpose and an unyielding readiness to act, qualities well suited to a country exhausted by endless conflict. Nobunaga understood that unification could not be achieved through compromise alone. He moved with speed, breaking rival coalitions before they could fully form. Firearms, still regarded with suspicion by many warriors, were embraced as tools of efficiency rather than dishonor. Battles under his command were coordinated, disciplined, and calculated, reflecting a new understanding of warfare as a matter of organization rather than individual valor. Equally significant was his approach to power. Religious institutions, long influential both spiritually and militarily, were brought under control or destroyed when they resisted. This was not an attack on belief itself, but on any authority that stood outside his command. In dismantling these structures, Nobunaga removed long-standing obstacles to centralized rule. Yet his ambition was not limited to conquest. He encouraged trade, protected merchants, and supported urban growth, recognizing that economic strength sustained military power. Castle towns flourished under his rule, becoming centers of commerce and administration. Governance, once fragmented, began to take on a coherent shape. For the samurai, Nobunaga's rise marked a turning point. Loyalty was demanded without illusion. Advancement depended on ability rather than lineage. Old families fell, new ones rose, and service became a matter of demonstrated competence. This merit-driven order appealed to some and unsettled others, further accelerating the transformation of the warrior class. Despite his successes, Nobunaga's rule was not gentle. Resistance was met with decisive force, and mercy was rare. His methods left little room for ambiguity. Yet in a time of constant war, this severity brought clarity. Territories under his control experienced relative stability, a glimpse of what unification might offer. His life, however, ended abruptly, not on a battlefield, but through betrayal. The suddenness of his fall underscored the volatility of the age. Even the most powerful were vulnerable, and no order was yet secure. Still, the momentum he created did not vanish. The structures he built and the precedents he set continued to shape events. His vision of a unified Japan remained incomplete, but it had been made imaginable. And as his legacy passed into the hands of those who followed, the country moved closer to a future defined not by endless struggle, but by enforced peace. After the abrupt silence left by Nobunaga's death, Japan did not fall back into chaos as many feared. Instead, The momentum he had set in motion was quietly gathered by a man who understood patience as well as power. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had risen from humble origins, shaped by observation rather than inheritance. Where his predecessor had ruled through force and disruption, Hideyoshi sought completion through consolidation. Hideyoshi moved carefully at first, securing loyalty through calculated generosity and symbolic gestures. He presented himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a unifier who could bring an end to generations of uncertainty. Military campaigns continued, yet they were increasingly framed as steps toward order rather than expressions of ambition. One by one, remaining rivals were absorbed or subdued until resistance became impractical. With unification largely achieved, Hideyoshi turned his attention inward. His greatest challenge was not how to win power, but how to preserve it. The samurai, long shaped by war, needed a place in a peaceful society. To address this, Hideyoshi imposed strict social divisions, separating warriors from farmers and artisans. Weapons were confiscated from the countryside, fixing the warrior class in its role and preventing future uprisings from below. These policies brought a sense of stability, but they also introduced rigidity. Society was carefully ordered, roles defined, movement restricted. For the samurai, identity became formalized. Service was no longer simply a matter of survival. It was a permanent status. Peace offered security, but it also demanded restraint. Hideyoshi's rule extended beyond Japan's borders in his later years, driven by a desire to project strength and perhaps secure legacy. These foreign campaigns strained resources and lives, revealing the limits of ambition in a newly unified land. At home, the balance he had constructed remained intact, but its future was uncertain, resting heavily on his personal authority. As his life drew to a close, the question of succession loomed. Hideyoshi had shaped a system that relied on careful control, yet he could not guarantee its continuity. The peace he enforced had not yet settled into something self-sustaining. When he died, the country paused once more. The structures remained, the divisions held, but power waited to be claimed. The next transition would not unfold through years of fragmentation, but through a single, decisive moment, one that would quietly determine the shape of Japan's long peace to come. The moment of decision arrived not with prolonged uncertainty, but with a gathering of forces that had been quietly preparing for years. After Hideyoshi's death, Japan entered a brief pause, one filled with formal councils and careful words. On the surface, unity remained intact. Beneath it, rival ambitions settled into place, waiting for an opportunity to resolve what patience alone could not. Tokugawa Ieyasu stood at the center of this stillness. He was neither the most flamboyant nor the most forceful of the era's leaders, but he possessed something rarer: endurance. Years of survival amid shifting loyalties had taught him restraint. He moved slowly, allowing others to reveal their intentions, gathering strength without drawing attention. When alignment finally gave way to division, he was ready. The Battle of Sekigahara unfolded as a convergence rather than a surprise. Armies assembled, not only with soldiers, but with expectations about the future. Many participants fought less for personal loyalty than for the order they believed would follow. The battlefield became a quiet referendum on stability itself. The fighting was brief by the standards of the age, but decisive. Strategy, timing, and the defection of key allies determined the outcome more than sheer force. When the smoke cleared, Tokugawa's position was unchallenged. Victory did not feel triumphant so much as final, as though an argument long unfolding had at last been settled. Sekigahara did not end conflict entirely, but it resolved uncertainty at the highest level. The surviving lords accepted the new balance, some willingly, others out of necessity. Resistance lingered in isolated forms, yet the momentum of unification was no longer reversible. What followed was careful consolidation. Tokugawa did not rush to remake society. Instead, he absorbed Hideyoshi's structures and refined them. Authority was distributed deliberately, rewards balanced with surveillance, autonomy granted within strict limits. Power became less visible, but more secure. For the samurai, this transition marked a subtle shift. The era of constant testing through battle had ended. Service remained central, but its expression changed. Loyalty was now measured in obedience and administration, as much as in combat. The warrior class stood at the threshold of a long transformation. Sekigahara was remembered as a battle, but its true significance lay in what followed. It opened the way for a peace unlike any Japan had known, not a fragile pause between wars, but a sustained order built on control, balance, and restraint. And as Tokugawa authority quietly settled across the land, the age of warriors entered a new phase, one defined not by the clash of swords, but by the discipline of stillness. With the establishment of Tokugawa rule, Japan entered a long and carefully managed peace. The new shogunate governed not through constant displays of force, but through systems designed to prevent conflict before it could begin. Order became routine, and routine became power. The absence of war reshaped the country more profoundly than any battlefield victory. The Tokugawa leaders understood the samurai's potential for disruption. To contain it, they transformed warriors into administrators. Samurai were required to live in castle towns, separated from the land they once defended directly. Their stipends replaced battlefield rewards, tying survival to service rather than conquest. Swords remained symbols of status, but their use became increasingly ceremonial. A complex network of rules bound regional lords to the central government. Domains retained autonomy in daily affairs, yet were closely monitored. Regular travel to the capital, financial obligations, and controlled succession ensured that no single lord could grow strong enough to challenge the shogunate. Stability was maintained not by trust, but by balance. For ordinary people, this era brought predictability. Roads improved, markets expanded, and agriculture stabilized. Towns grew, and culture flourished within defined limits. Theater, literature, and art reflected a society learning to express itself without the constant presence of war. Life was constrained, yet secure. For the samurai, the transition was more complex. Many found meaning in scholarship, bureaucracy, and moral cultivation. Codes of conduct were written, refining ideals of loyalty and discipline that had once been shaped by necessity. Yet beneath this refinement lay tension. Warriors trained for combat now lived lives defined by paperwork and protocol. Economic realities deepened this strain. Fixed stipends failed to keep pace with a growing commercial economy. Merchants, officially ranked below warriors, accumulated wealth and influence. Samurai prestige remained high, but material security often declined, creating quiet dissatisfaction. The peace held, not because it was perfect, but because it was carefully guarded. Rebellion was rare and swiftly contained. Generations passed without knowing war firsthand. Memory replaced experience, and the warrior identity slowly detached from its origins. In this prolonged stillness, The samurai class was preserved, yet subtly transformed. The qualities that once defined it, adaptability, readiness, violence, were constrained into forms suited for peace. And as the world beyond Japan began to change, this carefully balanced order would face challenges it was never designed to absorb. As the Tokugawa peace stretched from decades into centuries, its strengths became inseparable from its weaknesses. The system that had ended war now resisted change, holding society in a careful stillness while the world beyond Japan continued to shift. What had once been a source of stability gradually became a source of quiet tension, felt most deeply by the samurai themselves. The warrior class remained bound to its role, even as that role lost practical purpose. Samurai were expected to embody discipline, loyalty, and moral authority, yet opportunities to express these qualities grew increasingly abstract. Many devoted themselves to study, administration, and philosophy, searching for meaning within the limits imposed upon them. Others struggled silently, aware that their status no longer guaranteed security. Economic pressures intensified this unease. Commerce expanded, cities grew, and money, not land or military service, became the measure of influence. Merchants, officially placed below samurai in social rank, accumulated wealth and leverage. Warriors, reliant on fixed stipends, often found themselves in debt, their symbolic authority at odds with their financial reality. Respect remained, but it was increasingly formal. The shogunate responded cautiously. Reforms were introduced, then withdrawn, as leaders sought to preserve balance without altering the foundations of the system. Any significant change risked destabilizing the order they had worked so carefully to maintain. As a result, problems were managed rather than resolved, postponed rather than confronted. Intellectually, this period produced reflection and debate. Scholars questioned the nature of loyalty, governance, and moral responsibility. Some looked back to ancient ideals, others forward to imagined reforms. These discussions rarely reached open confrontation, but they revealed a growing awareness that the existing order was fragile beneath its calm surface. External pressure added another layer of strain. Encounters with foreign powers, limited at first, introduced new technologies and ideas that did not fit neatly into Tokugawa structures. The realization that isolation could not fully protect the country unsettled leaders and thinkers alike. The balance between preservation and adaptation became increasingly difficult to maintain. For most people, daily life continued much as before. Seasons passed, rituals endured, and peace remained unbroken. Yet the stillness now carried weight, as though held in place by effort rather than inevitability. The samurai, once agents of change, had become guardians of continuity, even as that continuity strained under the passage of time. By the mid-19th century, the question was no longer whether the system would change, but how, and whether the warrior class could survive that change intact. The answer would come not through gradual adjustment, but through a decisive transformation that would bring the samurai age to its final close. The final transformation arrived quietly at first, carried by reformist language rather than open revolt. When change came, it did not announce itself as the end of the samurai, but as the renewal of the state. The Meiji Restoration presented itself as a return, a restoration of imperial authority, of national strength, of balance between tradition and survival. Yet beneath these words lay a reality far more disruptive than any battle. Power shifted from the shogunate back to the emperor, not as a return to the past, but as a reconfiguration for the future. The new leadership understood that Japan could no longer exist as it had. Foreign powers pressed at its borders, and comparison revealed uncomfortable truths. Military strength, economic flexibility, and centralized authority had become necessities, not choices. The samurai found themselves at the center of this transformation, and gradually outside it. Their privileges were questioned, then dismantled. Stipends were reduced, then eliminated. The right to carry swords, once the visible marker of identity, was restricted and finally abolished. These changes were not framed as punishment, but as modernization. Still, for those who had lived by these symbols, the loss was profound. Some samurai adapted. They became officers in the new army, civil servants, teachers, and industrial leaders. Their discipline and education found new uses in a rapidly changing society. Others resisted, clinging to the belief that the old order could still be restored. Isolated uprisings followed, brief and decisive, their failure signaling the final end of armed resistance by the warrior class. The disappearance of the samurai was not marked by a single moment. It unfolded through policy, economy, and time. Within a generation, the class that had shaped Japan for centuries no longer existed as a living institution. What remained were ideals, stories, and memory, preserved, refined, and sometimes romanticized. Japan itself moved forward rapidly. Railways replaced roads once guarded by warriors. Conscription replaced hereditary service. The state no longer depended on personal loyalty, but on law and bureaucracy. Power became impersonal, efficient, and centralized in ways the samurai world had never been. Yet the legacy endured. Concepts of duty, endurance, and restraint continued to influence culture and behavior. The calm discipline cultivated during centuries of peace did not vanish. It transformed. The samurai lived on not as warriors, but as a foundation beneath modern identity. In the end, the rise and fall of the samurai was not a simple story of glory and decline. It was a long adaptation to changing needs, from survival to order, from order to stability, and finally from stability to renewal. Their age ended not in defeat, but in absorption, as history moved forward, carrying their imprint into a different kind of future.